I had just finished watering the basil on my kitchen windowsill when the phone rang. At this hour, I expected it might be Rowan checking in, though my son rarely called unless Sabine reminded him. But it wasn't his voice that greeted me. "Mirabelle Sabine," said the syllables clipped and precise, as though she were already short on patience. "Sabine," I replied evenly, setting the watering can down. "We're hosting dinner tomorrow evening." She continued skipping the usual niceties. "My parents flew in from Provence yesterday. They're eager to spend time with family, something intimate." Her phrasing made me pause. "Family," she said, but there was no warmth in the word. It was a category, not a circle. "And Rowan?" I asked. "Why isn't he the one calling?" There was a small, practiced laugh. "Oh, Rowan's swamped at the office, you know how it is. I thought it better to reach out myself and save him the trouble." I held the phone against my ear and studied the late afternoon light filtering through the maples outside. My son wasn't forgetful, not with things that mattered. If he hadn't called, it was because someone convinced him there was nothing worth mentioning. "What time?" I asked. 7:30 sharp. At our house in Lake Oswego. "Dress formally, please. My parents are very traditional about presentation." Her tone carried the faintest suggestion of correction, as if I might otherwise arrive in a sweatshirt. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remind her I'd heard the edge in her voice. "Of course," I said. Finally. "Wonderful." She softened her tone, but only slightly. "They're so looking forward to meeting you properly. Last time at the wedding was far too chaotic. This will be different. Different. That was one word for it. When the call ended, I left the phone on the counter and stood by the window. Outside the maple Rowan and I had planted when he was 12, swayed in the breeze, its branches grown thick, its roots deep. He had insisted on choosing that tree himself. "Something that lasts," he had said. And yet here I was invited to his table by someone else, instructed on what to wear, where to sit, how to behave. I poured myself a glass of water and drank slowly, steadying my breath. Sabine's words had been careful, but the care wasn't kindness. It was choreography, as if I were a prop she had to place on stage at the right time, in the right costume, saying nothing out of turn. Still, I would go. I had no intention of letting distance grow deeper between my son and me, not while there was still time to mend it. I rinsed the glass, set it down gently, and returned to the quiet of my kitchen. The basil leaves glistened from their watering, fragrant and strong, a reminder that roots once planted could endure more than anyone expected. Tomorrow evening, I would walk into Sabine's dining room with my head high and my silence ready. That night, sleep came in fragments. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen, and my mind drifted backward more than 3 decades to a city that had shaped me in ways few people ever cared to know. Paris in my 30s was not the postcard most people imagine. It wasn't all cafe terraces and romantic strolls. For me, it was paperwork negotiations and learning to speak French well enough to be taken seriously across a boardroom table. I had gone there with ambition and a stubborn belief that I could stand on my own, away from my husband's shadow, and build something lasting. The import business started modestly small shipments of Bordeaux wine to restaurants on the west coast of the United States. What I lacked in capital, I made up for in persistence. I spent long hours in chilly warehouses, inspected bottles, until my hands were numb and memorized every clause in the contracts I signed. My French improved out of necessity, sharpened. Each time someone assumed the American woman in the room didn't understand a word. I remember the look on one distributor's face when I corrected his miscalculation in French line by line without raising my voice. That moment taught me something I never forgot. Silence and precision cut deeper than outrage. But my late husband never saw it that way. When I returned to Portland after those 5 years, he said I had wasted my time. Focus on family, Mirabelle. That's where your real duty lies. He believed ambition was unbecoming in a wife. So I folded my files, stored away my contacts, and kept the memories like pressed flowers in an old book. Rowan was young then, and I told myself it was worth it for him. But deep down, the dismissal left a wound that never fully healed. Now, decades later, Sabine's call had reopened that scar. The careful instructions, the subtle command in her tone, it all echoed the same message I had heard before, that I was an accessory, not an equal. Lying in bed, I closed my eyes and let the French words I hadn't spoken in years roll through my mind. The cadence, the rhythm, the way sentences could conceal or reveal, depending on the speaker's intent. Henri and Colette might believe their language shielded them from me, but they had no idea they were walking into a room with someone who had once made her living navigating every nuance of it. I sat up, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and reached for the small wooden box I kept on the nightstand. Inside were mementos, an old fountain pen engraved with my initials, a faded business card from a Bordeaux firm, and a photograph of myself at 33 standing in front of a row of barrels, smiling with the certainty that I had a place in that world. I hadn't looked at that picture in years. Tonight, it felt less like a relic and more like a reminder. The house was quiet, but inside me, something had shifted. I could almost hear my younger self whispering that the skills I buried were still mine waiting. I placed the photograph on the dresser where I could see it in the morning. Whatever awaited me at Sabine's table, I would not arrive as the silent, pliant figure she expected. I had survived Paris boardrooms. I had survived being told to step aside. Tomorrow, I would walk into their dining room with more than dignity. I would walk in carrying every word they didn't think I could understand. The following evening, I drove down the highway toward Lake Oswego, the late spring sun lowering itself into a sky streaked with violet. The closer I came, the more the houses grew polished and identical, each lawn clipped with surgical precision. It was the kind of neighborhood where appearances stood taller than the people who lived inside. Rowan and Sabine's home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, large enough to make a statement but cold in its symmetry. I parked at the curb and studied the facade for a moment. Every window glowed with warm light, but it felt staged like the set of a play. I drew in a steady breath, straightened my jacket, and rang the bell. Sabine opened the door almost before the chime faded. She looked immaculate as she always did, hair pinned in a style that took more effort than it pretended, lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mirabelle," she said as though pronouncing my name were a test she had just passed. "You're right on time." Her voice carried the same clipped control I'd heard over the phone. She stepped aside with a sweep of her hand, ushering me into the foyer. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies carefully arranged for the occasion. Inside, everything gleamed marble counters, spotless floors, walls hung with art that matched too neatly to have been chosen with affection. It was a house meant to impress, not a home meant to live in. Henri and Colette stood in the living room, framed by the soft light of a chandelier. Henri was tall, silver hair combed with military precision, his posture effortlessly commanding. Colette wore pearls and an expression of detached grace, her eyes flicking over me like a jeweler assessing flawed stones. Mirabelle Sabine said again now to them as though she were presenting an exhibit. "My mother-in-law." Henri extended his hand with a smile that practiced civility without warmth. "Enchanté," he said. Colette nodded, her smile thinner, her gaze already drifting. At last, properly. I returned the greeting in English, but a dozen French responses surfaced in my mind, restrained behind my teeth. Their assumption that I would not understand was a gift I would not waste. Rowan entered. then his tie slightly askew, his expression caught between eagerness and unease. He kissed my cheek quickly, almost furtively. "Mom, glad you're here." "Of course," I said, holding his arm for a brief moment. His eyes avoided mine, flickering instead toward Sabine, who gave him the smallest nod, like a conductor cueing an instrument. Dinner was being arranged in the adjoining room, silverware, glinting under candlelight. I could hear the soft clink of crystal being set in place, the stage nearly ready for the performance. Sabine guided us toward the table, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Rowan followed beside her, his shoulders tight, his smile rehearsed. I stepped in behind them, feeling the weight of every glance, every expectation. This was their arena, but I had walked into more intimidating rooms than this one. The table gleamed, waiting for us to take our seats, and I knew the evening was only beginning. We took our places at the dining table as if settling into roles assigned long before I arrived. The silverware was aligned so precisely it looked measured with a ruler, and the flowers in the center towered high enough to half-obscure faces. A bottle of Bordeaux, its label elegant and self-assured, was brought out with ceremonial care. Henri lifted it with the reverence of a priest holding a chalice. From our own region, he said, his accent rolling through the syllables. "A fine year." Rowan nodded enthusiastically, his hand brushing Sabine's as he passed her a glass. "This will be a treat, Mom. You don't get wine like this every day." Sabine tilted her head, her smile cool. "Yes, not everyone appreciates the kind of quality my parents are accustomed to." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Henri poured, and Colette watched me as though she were gauging my reaction, before the liquid even touched my glass. The wine was deep ruby, catching the light of the chandelier. I lifted it, swirling gently, and inhaled. Plum oak graphite, the unmistakable signatures of Bordeaux. Memories rose unbidden late afternoons in dim cellars, the weight of contracts, the press of barrels stacked higher than I could see. I let none of that touch my face. "To family," Henri said, raising his glass. "To family," Rowan echoed, his voice too bright. Sabine's smile sharpened as she turned toward me. "And to progress," she added. "May the new generation lead us forward, unencumbered by the burdens of the past." Glasses clinked. I took a measured sip. The wine was excellent, but her words tasted bitter. Conversation flowed easily for them, smooth as the wine. Henri launched into a story about the challenges of modernizing vineyards, how older methods, though charming, were obstacles to growth. Colette agreed, adding with delicate precision, "Sometimes the older generation does not realize when it is time to step aside." Rowan cleared his throat, tried to laugh lightly. "Well, everyone brings something different to the table, right?" Sabine's eyes flicked to him before she leaned closer to her parents. "Yes, but some bring weight that slows the rest down. Dead weight." Her parents chuckled softly. Rowan shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. He looked at me then, only briefly, before dropping his gaze to the tablecloth. The words slid through the air, genteel in delivery, but cruel in substance. And then, as though they had crossed an invisible threshold, they switched into French. "Elle n'a rien à offrir," Colette murmured, lips barely moving. "She has nothing to offer." "Une vieille femme inutile," Henri replied. "A useless old woman." Sabine smirked, her tone lighter, but no less sharp. "Un fardeau pour son fils," a burden on her son. Their voices dropped just low enough to pass as private, but not low enough to be secret. They assumed, of course, that I sat blind and deaf in their language. I took another sip of wine, steady, unhurried. The words reached me clearly, each one sliding into the ledger I was already keeping in my mind. I had not crossed oceans, survived boardrooms, and raised a son, only to be broken by whispers in a language I knew better than they suspected. Rowan tried again, flustered. Why don't we talk about the expansion? The vineyard must be doing so well for you to think of growing. Henri smiled at him indulgently, the way one might smile at a child's attempt to interrupt adults. The conversation returned to French, the insults cloaked in cultured tones, each phrase another stone added to their small fortress of superiority. I smiled politely, nodding, when eyes turned to me, my silence, mistaken for ignorance. But inside, every word etched itself deeper, not as a wound, but as a record. The evening stretched forward, the courses still to come, and I already knew I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I kept my expression placid, the faint smile of someone grateful simply to be included. Sabine seemed satisfied with that picture, her gaze sweeping past me toward her parents, as though she had proven a point. But inside, I was translating each word, filing them away with the same discipline I once used in ledgers and contracts. Useless. Dead weight. Burden. Every syllable entered the record I kept, silently behind my eyes. I did not need pen or paper to know I would not forget. Rowan chuckled nervously whenever the table grew too still, his laugh thin and uncertain. I could tell he didn't fully understand the French his in-laws slipped into, but he understood the tone, dismissive, superior, sharpened, like knives hidden beneath linen. He tried to bridge the gaps, clinking his glass again, asking questions about the vineyard's expansion. His efforts fell flat. Sabine smirked openly, as if my silence confirmed her dominance. When she leaned toward her mother and whispered in French, "Elle ne comprend pas un mot." She doesn't understand a word. I resisted the temptation to respond in their tongue. Instead, I took a slow sip of wine and nodded politely, as though the evening were unfolding exactly as it should. The soup course ended, plates cleared. The main dish arrived fragrant with rosemary and butter. Conversation turned to the inefficiencies of traditional families, the need to modernize to lighten the load. Each phrase had two meanings, one about business, another aimed squarely at me. I cut my meat carefully, methodically chewing with patience. Every gesture reminded me of late nights in Paris, reviewing contracts clause by clause, while men in dark suits underestimated me. They always learned, eventually. Colette dabbed her lips with her napkin and murmured something about generations who cling to relevance. Henri added a soft laugh, dismissive like one might laugh at a child's fantasy. Sabine's hand brushed Rowan's arm as she said in English, "We all have to know when to let go, don't we?" Rowan shifted uncomfortably. He looked at me then, but only briefly. His eyes darted away almost as soon as they met mine, as if he couldn't bear to see whether I had been wounded. I wasn't wounded. I was taking inventory. By the time dessert was served, my ledger was full. I knew the balance of their arrogance against my silence, and the scales would not remain this way forever. But not tonight. Tonight's silence was the most potent weapon I had because it allowed them to believe they were safe. When the final glass was drained and the evening drew to a close, I rose with steady grace, thanking Sabine for her hospitality. She tilted her chin with quiet triumph, convinced she had put me in my place. Henri and Colette shook my hand as though indulging a formality. Rowan kissed my cheek again, eyes troubled, words caught in his throat. I walked out into the cool night air and let it fill my lungs. The stars were bright above the quiet streets, but I saw only the words they had spoken, lined up in order, a record, etched as clearly as ink. By the time I slid into my car, I had decided tomorrow I would begin writing it all down properly. The house was quiet when I returned, the kind of stillness that carries both comfort and accusation. I set my keys on the counter and stood for a long moment in the dim light, the words of the evening still echoing in my head. They hadn't known I understood, but my silence had carried every syllable back with me. I went to my desk, pulled out a leather-bound journal I hadn't touched in years, and opened it to a fresh page. My handwriting was steady as I began to write line after line, each insult transcribed exactly as it had been spoken. Useless, old woman, burden on her son. I recorded them in both languages, English and French, as if to prove to myself that the ledger was complete. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page. Seeing the words in ink drained them of their sting. They were not wounds anymore. They were entries, evidence debts waiting to be balanced. I closed the journal and reached into the bottom drawer of the desk where I kept old folders I rarely touched. The cardboard was worn at the edges, labels smudged from years of handling. Inside were contracts, letters, and notes from my time in Paris. Some of the companies had folded, but others I knew had grown stronger. My fingers traced the names, importers, distributors, vineyard owners. People who had once taken me seriously before I let their dismissal and my husband's disapproval convince me to set it all aside. I pulled out one folder marked Bordeaux 1989 and flipped through the yellowing pages. Contact lists, shipping agreements, profit ledgers. It all looked foreign for a moment, and then the numbers came back to life. It was like finding a language I hadn't spoken in years but still understood fluently. A card slipped out. One I had tucked away, Thomas Verrier, export consultant. I remembered his sharp wit, the way he once told me that wine was less about grapes and more about leverage. He'd meant it as a joke, but tonight the line struck differently. I placed the card on the desk and sat back. The insults didn't matter. Their laughter at my expense didn't matter. Words could be shrugged off, forgotten by morning. But assets, those dictated. Who held the pen at the end of the meeting? Who controlled the narrative? Who decided which voices counted? I realized then that if I wanted to answer them, it wouldn't be with speeches or confrontations. It would be with numbers on a page, signed contracts, ownership percentages. They had made a mistake assuming I was powerless. They had mistaken quiet for absence. I picked up the card again, tapping it lightly against the journal where their insults were written. Silence had been my shield tonight, but it wouldn't be the end of my strategy. By the time I turned off the light, the ledger was closed, and the first step of something larger had begun to form in my mind. Tomorrow, I would make the call. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual. Sleep had been shallow, broken by fragments of French words I'd tried to leave in the dining room the night before. But as the sun cut through the blinds, I knew what I needed to do. I brewed coffee, the smell rich and grounding, then placed Thomas Verrier's card on the table. It had been more than 25 years since we last spoke. For a moment, I wondered if he'd even remember me, or if time and distance had erased my name the way my husband once tried to erase my ambitions. I dialed the number printed beneath his name. It rang twice, and a man's voice, older but still quick, answered. "Allo, Thomas. It's Mirabelle Heron, from Portland. We worked together on the Bordeaux shipments years ago." A pause. Then a laugh, warm, surprised. "Mirabelle, mon Dieu. I thought you'd forgotten all of us. I remember you well. How are you, my friend?" "I'm well," I said, though. My voice carried more weight than that simple answer deserved. "I need your help, of course." What kind of help, I told him carefully, but without flinching about Rowan's in-laws, Henri and Colette Delcourt, and their vineyard. I explained that I needed to know more about their standing in France, particularly their financial health. There was a silence on the line as he considered. "The Delcourts," he said finally. "Yes, I know them. They've been trying to expand aggressively, chasing prestige. But prestige is expensive, Mirabelle. Very expensive." I leaned forward, gripping my mug. "What do you mean they've taken on debt?" he said. "Too much. A large bridge loan from a California distributor to cover new equipment and marketing. Their exports are not performing as they hoped. And the U.S. market. It is uncertain, fickle. One wrong harvest, one late shipment, and the whole structure shakes. I let his words sink in. Henri and Colette, so polished, so smug at that dinner table, were standing on a foundation made of sand. Tomas continued, I've heard they plan a capital call to raise funds for expansion. They expect their minority investors to contribute. But those investors are weary, some already looking for a way out. I tapped the journal beside me, the one where their insults were written. And if no one contributes, then whoever covers the call gains leverage, Thomas said simply. Potentially, control. The Delcourts are proud, but numbers don't bow to pride. Control. The word settled deep inside me, heavier than any insult Sabine had whispered. Can you send me documentation? I asked. Yes, I'll email what I have. Summaries, debt schedules, market notes. You'll see for yourself. But tell me, Mirabelle, why this sudden interest? You've been quiet all these years. I thought of Sabine's smirk, the way Rowan's eyes slid away from mine, the careful cruelty hidden in French phrases. Because they assume silence means weakness. They're about to learn otherwise. Thomas chuckled softly. Then you'll need more than silence. You'll need precision. But if anyone can remind them, it is you. We said our goodbyes, and when I hung up, I sat back in my chair, the coffee cooling beside me. My heart was steady. This was no longer about words spoken at a dinner table. This was about leverage, about whether dignity could be restored through the language of numbers, rather than arguments. By noon, Tomas's documents arrived in my inbox. I opened them carefully, scrolling through pages of figures, debts, covenants, and projections. The picture was clear. The Delcourt vineyard was dressed in silk, but bleeding underneath. They were counting on American investors to save them, unaware that one of those investors might turn out to be me. I closed the laptop, placed my hands flat on the desk, and let the weight of the decision settle over me. The insults were written in my journal. Now I had something to write in theirs. Tomorrow I would decide how to use it. I called Rowan the next afternoon and asked if he could meet me for coffee. He hesitated, his voice tight, but finally agreed to stop by a cafe near his office. When I arrived, he was already there, tapping at his phone with the distracted air of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. Mom, he said, standing quickly and leaning in for a half-hearted hug. Everything okay? I should ask you that, I replied, taking my seat. You seemed uneasy last night. He gave a short laugh, more air than sound. Dinner was fine. My in-laws can be a little, well, you know how the French are. Formal, opinionated. That's one word for it, I said. Rowan frowned, stirring the sugar into his coffee, though he never took it sweet. Look, Mom, I know you probably felt out of place. Sabine's parents? They can come across strong, but you don't have to read too much into it. I studied him for a moment. I don't need to read into anything. I heard enough. His spoon clattered against the cup. He froze, then forced a smile. You don't speak French. I met his eyes, letting silence carry the truth. His smile faltered. Mom, he rubbed his forehead, his voice dropping. Please don't make this worse. Sabine's parents didn't mean anything by it. They're just traditional. Critical, sure, but not malicious. They called me useless, I said, evenly. They called me a burden, in front of you. And you laughed, Rowan. His face flushed. I didn't understand everything. I was trying to keep the mood light. You know how Sabine gets when things feel tense. I was just what I pressed. Just smoothing over. Just pretending not to hear his shoulders sagged. It's easier that way. There it was. The truth spoken so simply, it nearly broke me. Easier that way. Easier to ignore the insult. Easier to let his wife's smirk pass unchallenged. Easier to let me stand alone in the very house I had once helped him pay for. Rowan, I said softly. Easier for whom he looked away, eyes fixed on the window, where cars rolled past in steady streams. For everyone. For me. For Sabine. For you, even. Don't you think it's better not to stir things up? I wanted to reach across the table, shake him. Remind him of the boy who once planted a maple tree in our yard and declared it would stand for generations. That boy had believed in roots and strength, in things worth defending. Now I saw only a man who bent himself into the shape Sabine required. You think peace is the same as harmony, I said. But peace, built on silence, is fragile. It shatters the moment someone pushes harder. He rubbed his temples. I can't fight every battle. Not with Sabine. Not with her parents. You don't know what it's like, I know exactly what it's like. I interrupted, my voice steady. I spent years swallowing my own ambitions to keep a marriage peaceful. I let myself believe silence was survival. But silence is never neutral, Rowan. It always serves someone. His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. I reached for my cup, though my coffee had gone cold. You may choose to let them diminish me. I won't. You can't see the danger yet, but you will. They're not only shaping how you see me, they're shaping how you see yourself. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands restless. Please, Mom. Just let it go. I stood smoothing my coat. I'll let nothing go that was meant to erase me. He looked up startled, but I offered only a faint smile. Take care of yourself, Rowan. As I walked out of the cafe, the weight of his words lingered. Easier that way. But nothing worth saving had ever been easy. Tomorrow I would set my own course with or without his courage. The day after meeting Rowan, I sat at my desk long after the morning sun had shifted across the floorboards. His words, "Just let it go," still echoed in my head, but I had no intention of obeying them. If he lacked the will to confront the insult, then I would carry it for both of us. Not with arguments, not with raised voices, but with something they would never anticipate. I pulled my laptop closer, the journal of insults lying open beside it like a witness. Tomas's documents were still fresh in my inbox. I read them again, the Delcourt's vineyard, their debt schedule, the looming capital call. Every figure confirmed what I already knew. Pride had built them a palace, but debt had hollowed the foundation. To act, I needed a mask. Something clean, untraceable. Years ago in Paris, I learned that business was not only about contracts, it was about appearances. You didn't walk into a negotiation as yourself, you walked in as the version they couldn't ignore. So I began forming a new shell. I chose a name that carried both solidity and distance, Silverwood Ridge Holdings. Wyoming offered what I needed, privacy, efficiency, no unnecessary questions. Within hours, with the right filings and a discreet registered agent, the company existed on paper, waiting to be filled with purpose. I sat back, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, marveling at how quickly the world could change with a few strokes of a keyboard. Yesterday, I had been dismissed as a burden. Today, I held the outline of something that could shift an empire. The next step required more than paperwork. Thomas had mentioned the California distributor who had extended the Delcourts a bridge loan. I made a call, posing as an assistant for Silverwood Ridge, inquiring whether their note might be reassigned. The man on the other end sounded weary, the kind of weariness born of risk. He admitted cautiously that they were eager to lighten exposure. The vineyard was glamorous but unpredictable, and investors with nervous boards didn't like unpredictability. We moved carefully through the details, price timing, transfer conditions. I asked few questions and gave fewer answers, knowing silence often created its own authority. By evening, I had wired the funds. The debt note changed hands, sliding quietly across the ledger of ownership until it rested under my name, or rather, under Silverwood Ridge. When the confirmation email arrived, I read it twice, then printed the document and placed it in a new folder, labeled simply, First Move. I closed my eyes and pictured the dinner table again, Henri's indulgent smile, Colette's thinly veiled disdain, Sabine's smirk. They had laughed at the image of me, an aging woman, powerless, too irrelevant to understand their words. Now, without a whisper of warning, I had become their creditor. It wasn't triumph I felt, but steadiness, the return of something I had once known in Paris. Back then, I had walked into rooms where no one expected me to matter, and I had left with contracts signed in my favor. Tonight, I held a piece of their world in my hands, and they didn't even know it. I slid the folder into the desk drawer, turned off the light, and let the room settle into quiet. The first chess piece was on the board, and for the first time in years, I felt the game begin. Tomorrow, I would decide where to move next. 10 days after Silverwood Ridge Holdings came into existence, an email landed in the inbox I had set up for it. The subject line was plain capital call notice, Delcourt Vineyard expansion. I opened it slowly, though my heart already knew what I would find. The Delcourts had set their sights on new tanks bottling upgrades and a marketing campaign aimed at the American market. Expansion required cash, and cash was exactly what they lacked. The terms were clear: each investor would need to contribute their share or risk dilution. I sat back in my chair and let the irony wash over me. Henri and Colette, who spoke so confidently of progress and legacy, were in truth dependent on others to carry them forward. Their empire rested on money they did not control. I read the notice again, noting the deadlines, the penalties, the quiet threats hidden in legal phrasing. If the minority investors hesitated, the vineyard would fall further into weakness. And if one investor stepped forward with certainty, the balance of power would shift. I called Thomas to confirm what I already understood. Yes, he said, his voice calm, but edged with satisfaction. This is their vulnerable point. Many of the smaller investors have grown impatient. They are tired of waiting for returns. They will decline politely, and the Delcourts know it. And if one steps forward, then control follows. You have the note, Mirabelle. You have the right. If you answer this call in full, you will not only steady the vineyard, you will own it. The simplicity of it was startling. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat in silence. My hand rested on the journal where I had written their insults. The ledger they had started was about to be balanced. I prepared the transfer with deliberate care. Each form signed each wire instruction, confirmed each document uploaded to the portal. Numbers moved across screens, impersonal and exact. Money had no emotion, but tonight it carried memory. By the end of the week, Silverwood Ridge Holdings was listed as the sole contributor to the capital call. The others had declined gracefully, unwilling to risk more. The vineyard now rested on one back mine. The updated cap table arrived late on a Friday afternoon. I opened it slowly, as though unfolding a verdict. There it was, in black and white, Silverwood Ridge Holdings, 51.2%. Majority. Control. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't victory that filled me, not yet, but clarity. On paper, the Delcourts no longer ruled their vineyard. Their pride was intact, only because they hadn't seen the numbers. Reality lagged behind the documents, but soon it would catch up. I set the papers aside and looked out the window. The maple Rowan had planted swayed gently in the breeze, its branches sturdy after all these years. Roots, I thought. Roots matter more than appearances. Henri and Colette had cultivated appearances, but their roots were shallow. And shallow roots snap when the ground shifts. I picked up my pen and wrote a single line in my journal, beneath the list of insults, 51.2%. It was not a boast. It was a fact. And facts, unlike words, did not vanish in the morning. When the sun slipped lower and the house filled with quiet, I closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and let the silence settle around me. Tomorrow the vineyard would still appear to belong to Henri and Colette, but tomorrow, too, they would begin to learn that appearances no longer dictated truth. The first ripple reached me not from France, but from Sabine herself. She called one afternoon, her voice sharper than usual, the kind of sharpness meant to conceal unease. "My parents have been unsettled," she said. "There are inconsistencies in the vineyard's reports. Certain investors aren't behaving as expected. It's unusual." I let her words hang, offering no comfort. "Unusual how they're vague," she admitted. "Too vague. Normally, everyone contributes quietly, reliably, but now things feel altered." I imagined Henri pacing his study, Colette whispering at his side, both of them wondering why the ground beneath them suddenly tilted. They had built their lives on confidence, but numbers did not care for confidence. Numbers bowed only to those who could pay. "And you?" I asked. "Does it trouble you?" She hesitated. I could almost hear her choosing between honesty and pretense. "It intrigues me. If someone is moving behind the scenes, it would take a certain boldness. My parents are rarely surprised, Mirabelle. They don't enjoy it." There was a pause. The silence waited. I knew she was studying my breathing, searching for a flicker of reaction. I gave her nothing. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, less dismissive, more probing. "You've been quiet lately, quieter than usual." "I've been living my life," I said, simply. "Yes." The word was stretched, skeptical. "Still, I've noticed a change." "Rowan hasn't. Of course, he notices very little when it comes to you. But I have." That admission told me more than she intended. Sabine's smirk might hide cruelty, but she was not careless. She sensed disturbance, like a predator scenting the air. She didn't yet know where the danger lay, but she knew it was there. I let her speak of vineyard strategies and expansion plans, her words rushing to fill the space I left empty. Beneath the surface of her chatter, I heard the strain in her voice, the edge of suspicion. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently. For the first time since this began, I felt her eyes on me, not with contempt, but with calculation. She had always seen me as irrelevant, a prop in the background of her marriage. Now, perhaps for the first time, she wondered if I was something else. That evening at dinner, Rowan tried to recount the conversation, oblivious to the undercurrent. "Sabine's worried about her parents," he said, spearing his food without looking up. "Apparently, some investors are acting strange. She says it'll work out, though. It always does." I nodded, letting him believe what he needed to. But inside, I understood the truth. Things did not always work out. They worked out for those who moved first, who played the long game, who kept their silence until the moment came to speak. Rowan was blind to it. But Sabine had started to smell the smoke, even if she couldn't yet find the fire. And that was fine. Let her look at me differently. Let her wonder. Suspicion was only the first stage of fear. I closed my journal that night with a calm hand, my notes written. Clearly, Sabine aware. Caution required. Continue. The pieces were in motion and the board was nearly set. The decision came to me in the quiet hours of the morning when even the house seemed to hold its breath. I could not move forward as Mirabelle Heron. They had dismissed that woman at the table already. What they respected, what they feared, was power dressed in formality. So I chose a name that sounded precise, discreet, and distinctly French. Marie Duval. I drafted the letter on heavy stationery, one I'd ordered years ago and never used. The watermark shimmered faintly in the light as I wrote, my pen moving in careful strokes. To Monsieur and Madame Delcourt. As a new majority investor with a strong interest in the vineyard's future, I request the honor of a dinner meeting with all active family representatives present. My intention is simple: to better understand the people behind the work I now support, and to ensure harmony as we move forward. I kept the tone neutral, polished, the kind that revealed nothing yet demanded respect. No flourish, no hint of confrontation, only civility laced with authority. When I signed it, Marie Duval, Silverwood Ridge Holdings. I felt the weight of the words settle like stones in water. The mask was complete. 2 days later, Thomas confirmed that the courier had delivered it to Provence. By the following afternoon, a reply arrived. Elegant stationery, ornate handwriting. We would be honored to receive you. The family will be present. We look forward to welcoming you in Portland at your earliest convenience. I folded the letter and slipped it into my journal directly opposite the page where I had listed their insults. On one side, contempt. On the other, courtesy. Both written in ink, both unchangeable. Not long after Rowan called, his voice carried Sabine's triumph before he even spoke. Mom, you'll never believe it. Sabine says her parents are ecstatic. They've landed a serious investor, someone very formal, very French. Apparently, this Marie Duval is coming to dinner. It's huge. I let my breath out slowly. Is that so? Yes, he rushed on. Sabine says it validates everything they've been working toward. She knew their strategies would attract the right kind of people. She says this proves her family's vision is the future. Behind his words, I could almost hear Sabine herself pacing the room, delivering her victory speech through him. That's wonderful, I said evenly. He sounded relieved, as if repeating Sabine's confidence could shield him from doubt. Sabine thinks this will set us up for generations. She says her parents will finally get the recognition they deserve. And she wants you to see that. Maybe you'll understand now. I smiled into the receiver, though my son couldn't see it. Perhaps I will. When the call ended, I closed my eyes and sat in the quiet. Henri and Colette were thrilled Sabine was gloating. Rowan was convinced. And none of them knew that the name on their letter, the investor they planned to impress, was the very woman they had once mocked as useless. The table was being set again, but this time the head of it would not belong to them. The dining room was already set when I arrived. White linen pressed to perfection. Silver glinting in the low light, a single glass of Burgundy resting untouched at my place. The restaurant had honored my request for quiet, thick drapes muffled the sounds of the city, and the frosted glass walls kept the world at bay. It was a room prepared not for spectacle, but for precision. I sat at the head of the table, the title they believed belonged to them, and let the stillness settle around me. My coat draped across the chair, my hands folded loosely, my face composed. I had practiced this expression in the mirror for days, the calm of someone who neither sought nor feared confrontation. The door opened just before the appointed hour. Sabine swept in, first radiant in silk, the color of champagne. Her smile gleamed with triumph, the kind that assumes victory before the game has begun. Behind her, Henri and Colette entered arm in arm, their elegance polished, their pride palpable. Henri's silver hair caught the light, and Colette's pearls gleamed against her throat. Rowan followed last. He wore his best suit, but it did little to conceal the tension in his shoulders. His smile was thin, his eyes flicking nervously between Sabine and me, as though he sensed fault lines beneath the polished floor. Madame Duval. Sabine said, her voice rich with pride as she approached. We are honored to welcome you. I rose slowly, inclining my head. Bonsoir. Henri extended his hand. Marie Duval. At last we meet. Your interest in our vineyard is most encouraging. Encouraging? Yes, I replied evenly, clasping his hand briefly. Colette gave me the kind of smile she reserved for patrons she wished to impress. We hope tonight you will see what makes our work so worthy of your investment. I gestured toward the table. Please. Sit. They settled in Sabine beside Rowan, her posture straight, her face glowing with the confidence of someone certain she had engineered a triumph. Rowan adjusted his napkin 3 times, his hands restless. The waiter entered with quiet efficiency, pouring wine into their glasses. leaving mine untouched as I had requested. Conversation began as expected. Henri describing the vineyard's traditions, Colette extolling its reputation, Sabine translating their pride into the language of inevitability. I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged. Their words painted pictures of growth, of legacy, of a future gleaming with expansion. But beneath the gilded phrases I heard the desperation Thomas had warned me of. Their pride was stretched thin, covering cracks already too wide. Rowan cleared his throat, once his voice uncertain. It's really remarkable what my in-laws have accomplished. I think we're all lucky to be part of it. Sabine touched his arm lightly, silencing him without words. She turned her gaze to me. My parents have always believed in excellence. They've built something extraordinary, and with the right partners it will flourish even more. Her tone was confident, but her eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, searching for reassurance. Suspicion, once faint, had begun to sharpen into watchfulness. I inclined my head slightly. Excellence requires more than vision. It requires stability. Henri leaned forward, eager. Of course. And that is precisely why your support means so much. With you, we can ensure the vineyard's future for generations. The waiter set down the first course. Delicate plates placed carefully in front of us. Silver chimed softly. Glasses caught the light. Yet beneath the elegance, the air had shifted. Rowan's hands tightened around his fork, his knuckles pale. He glanced at me again, searching as if he sensed I was not here merely as a guest,